Which is the craziest or most dramatic single season in Formula One history? Some fans may point to 2021, when there was a titanic battle between Lewis Hamilton and Max Verstappen, a battle with many flashpoints and defining moments between the two drivers, with the Drivers' Championship only being decided on the last lap of the last race of the season in controversial fashion. Some fans may say 2012, where 7 winners from the first 7 races happened, and a late-season title charge from a young Sebastian Vettel also happened to usurp Fernando Alonso in Brazil in one of the most dramatic title-deciding races in Formula One history. However, what if I were to tell you that there was another season that had more crazy underdog stories than 2012 and more championship drama than 2021, all in one package? Let me tell you the story of 1982, the single craziest season in Formula One history. This season was a very transitional one for 2 reasons. Firstly, the old Cosworth DFV engine, which had had 144 wins, powering many cars since 1967, had started to fall out of favour due to the rise of turbo engines in Formula One. This meant that turbo engines initially were far more powerful than the normally aspirated DFV, but the turbocharged engines were also very unreliable, with early versions of Renault's turbocharged engine chassis taking nearly 2 years to even get a points finish in the hands of Frenchman Jean-Pierre Jabouille. By the start of the 1982 season, they were reasonably reliable enough that 4 teams opted to use turbocharged engines. They were Renault, Ferrari, Brabham and Toleman. The rest of the teams, bar Alfa Romeo, were still using the previously far more ubiquitous DFV, and the aforementioned 4 teams all had different engine suppliers, with Ferrari and Renault being works teams, Brabham having BMW power, and Toleman being powered by Hart, the ex-England and Manchester City goalkeeper. The other reason this was a transitional year is because it was just the second year in which the first Concord Agreement had been in place. For those unaware, the Concord Agreement is a contract between the FIA and the teams which dictate a number of things, from how the teams actually compete in the races to the distribution of prize money and television revenues. Before this agreement, there were 2 governing bodies, FISA and FOCA. FISA was the organisation which the big teams were aligned with, the big works teams were aligned with, namely Ferrari, Renault and Alfa Romeo. FOCA were the smaller teams organisation, and they were unhappy that FISA gave more prize money to the works teams than to privateer teams. Most of the issues regarding the governing bodies were solved by 1982 through the signing of that Concord Agreement, but some issues were still obviously present as the season progressed. And with that, let's get into the season. The season started in South Africa at the Kyalami circuit. René Arnoux qualified on pole position in his turbocharged Renault, followed by Nelson Piquet's Brabham and the Ferrari of Gilles Villeneuve. The Williams cars of Keke Rosberg and Carlos Reutemann were the highest placed normally aspirated cars in 7th and 8th place. On race day, it was Alain Prost who won from 5th on the grid, followed by Carlos Reutemann, Arnoux, the McLaren of recently returning Niki Lauda, Keke Rosberg and the other McLaren of John Watson. The season had started with controversy, however, as FISA had changed the conditions of the super licence, including tying drivers to their teams for up to 3 years at a time. Following a driver strike which saw them all stay in the same hotel room, mattresses lading the floor, with entertainment from Elio De Angelis, who was playing the piano. Following threats from FISA and the drivers respectively, a compromise was reached as the drivers were handed suspended fines, which were then reduced, and the FIA Court of Appeal criticised the handling of the situation by FISA. The season was very nearly over before it started due to FISA, and the results of the race were definitely overshadowed by the politics surrounding the weekend. The race at the Yacaparagua circuit was both controversial and it was also strange, as many drivers suffered from heat exhaustion due to the heat. Alain Prost took the second pole position for Renault in 2 races, followed by the Ferrari of Gilles Villeneuve and Keke Rosberg's Williams. During the race, Piquet led from Rosberg, but after the race, both drivers were disqualified due to being underweight. The teams had put 26 litres worth of water into tanks to quote-unquote cool the brakes. Although they would dump this water on the track shortly after setting off out the pits, they would then top the tanks back up again after the race had finished to get back above the legal weight limit. After the top two drivers' disqualification, it meant Alain Prost won his second race in a row, followed by John Watson's McLaren and the Lotus of Nigel Mansell. Michele Alboreto got fourth in his Tyrrell, followed by the ATS of German Manfred Winkelhock. Didier Pironi rounded out the point scorers in sixth for Ferrari. This result left Prost in the championship lead on 18 points, followed by John Watson on 7, Reutemann on 6, with Arnoux and Mansell on 4. In the Constructors' Championship, Renault led on 22 points, followed by McLaren on 10, Williams on 8, Lotus on 4 and Tyrrell on 3. 2 races, 2 controversies, unrest amongst the drivers, teams and governing bodies was rife. 3 races, 3 different pole sitters. This time, it was the unfancied Alfa Romeo of Andrea de Cesaris who started from the front. He was followed by the experienced Niki Lauda and by René Arnoux. De Cesaris led from the off, with his teammate Bruno Giacomelli in 4th behind Lauda and Arnoux. After Giacomelli attempted a move at the hairpin which saw him lock and slide into Arnoux, Lauda moved up to 2nd. After Lauda pushed to catch up, De Cesaris lost the lead while trying to lap the slow Raul Boesel. De Cesaris then crashed on lap 34, distracted by smoke from an engine fire which eliminated Lauda's competition for the win. He was followed home by Keke Rosberg and Gilles Villeneuve, and it was 3 controversies and 3 races, however, as Villeneuve was disqualified for having an illegal rear wing following a protest against it by other teams. Following Gilles' disqualification, Riccardo Patrese inherited the 2nd podium of his career, followed by Michele Alboreto's Tyrrell, the Lotus of Elio De Angelis and McLaren's John Watson. Lauda's win shot him up to 2nd in the Drivers' Championship, 6 points off of Prost, who retired early on in the Long Beach race. Rosberg was 3rd in the standings on 8 points, the same tally as John Watson. Carlos Reutemann's Williams was in 5th place on 6 points, although the Argentine had now officially retired from Formula 1 following the breakout of the Falklands War. He felt that his position in a British team was untenable, especially considering his ambitions to become a politician in his home nation of Argentina. This sudden departure meant Williams needed a replacement driver, and a 42-year-old Mario Andretti agreed to fill in the slot, albeit only for this Long Beach race. In the Constructors' battle, it was still Renault up top on 22 points, followed by a bolstered McLaren on 20, Williams on 14, and Lotus and Tyrrell on 6. As we moved into the Imola race, the championship was hotting up. I just said that the championship was hotting up. Well, in Imola, it boiled over. In response to the disqualification of Nelson Piquet and Keke Rosberg from the Brazilian race, the FOCA-aligned teams protested by boycotting the San Marinese race, meaning only 14 cars took part, those of Ferrari, Renault, Tyrrell, Alfa Romeo, Toleman, Osella and ATS. René Arnoux became the first driver to take 2 pole positions in 1982 when he qualified first, followed by teammate Prost. The Ferraris of Villeneuve and Pironi were 3rd and 4th, with the rest of the teams no less than 3.5 seconds back. It was clearly a race between Renault and Ferrari. However, after Prost then Arnoux both retired due to engine issues, it was just Villeneuve and Pironi out front. With victory certain, the Ferrari drivers were given orders by their pit boards to slow down. Villeneuve interpreted this as an order to maintain position as well as slow down. However, his ever-determined teammate Didier Pironi thought the order meant they should just slow down but still race for position, hence why he jostled for position with Gilles towards the end of the race. Gilles thought Pironi was just trying to make the race more exciting for the fans and he would let him cross the finish line first. However, following a last lap overtake at Tosa, Didier's intentions became clear. Didier Pironi won the San Marino race, followed by disgusted and distraught Villeneuve, who felt betrayed. He vowed after the race to never speak to Didier again, at all. Michele Alboreto came 3rd for Tyrrell, with Jean-Pierre Jarier's Osella in 4th place, and Eliseo Salazar was 5th for ATS. Salazar's teammate Manfred Winkelhock was disqualified for being underweight, and this was the peak of the FISA FOCA war. Other races, which had been boycotted by FOCA, had gone down as non-championship events to avoid drama. However, this one counted towards the championship, which enraged the FOCA teams. Going into the 5th round in Belgium, there had been 3 winners and 3 pole sitters in 4 races, along with a controversial event to go with every single race. Alain Prost still led the Drivers' Championship on 18 points, despite having not finished either of the previous 2 races, followed by Niki Lauda on 12 points. Didier Pironi moved up to 3rd place, joint with Michele Alboreto on 10 points, and Keke Rosberg was now 5th on 8 points. At the 5th round in Belgium, the trajectory of the season would change irrevocably, as during the final qualifying session, Ferrari's Gilles Villeneuve approached a slow Jochen Mass, and the German moved to the inside of the circuit to allow Gilles to overtake on the racing line. However, Gilles also pulled to the inside of the circuit to try and overtake on the inside due to a miscommunication error. The two cars collided and the Ferrari cartwheeled into the air, with Villeneuve thrown aggressively from the car into the catch fencing surrounding the track, still strapped into his seat. He was pronounced dead later that day, aged 32, and Ferrari withdrew from the race the next day out of respect. Gilles was not just a title contender, but a fan favourite, as his aggressive style captured many people's eyes as he was able to drag terrible machinery to good results. But now, he was gone. With that, and the Ferrari withdrawal, the Renault drivers locked out the front row. However, both their cars retired from the race, which allowed the naturally aspirated cars of McLaren and Williams to fight for the win. After 70 laps, John Watson, who had started from 12th place, made it 4 different winners in the first 5 races in his McLaren. Keke Rosberg finished second for Williams, and Niki Lauda finished third, only to later be disqualified for being underweight. With a lack of top teams finishing the race, American Eddie Cheever came home third for Ligier, following Lauda's disqualification, followed by Elio De Angelis' Lotus in 4th. Nelson Piquet's Brabham was in 5th, and Chico Serra picked up the last points position for Fittipaldi in 6th. Watson's win also put him second in the Drivers' Championship, just 1 point behind Prost, who was still leading the championship despite having only finished 2 races so far this season. Keke Rosberg was now up to 3rd on 14 points, and Lauda dropped to 4th on 12 points, with Ferroni in 5th on 10 points. McLaren had now also surpassed Renault in the Constructors' Championship on 29 points compared to Renault's 22. Williams were now 3rd on 20 thanks to Ferrari's withdrawal, as Ferrari were now stagnant on 16, and Tyrrell were 5th on 10 points. After one of the saddest weekends in recent memory, the teams would now move on to the glitz and glamour of the Principality of Monaco. Out of respect for the recently deceased Gilles Villeneuve, Ferrari only ran 1 car in Monaco, that of Didier Pironi. René Arnoux put his Renault on pole position, making it 5 poles from 6 races for the Renault team. Riccardo Patrese was in 2nd place for Brabham, using the naturally aspirated Ford engine instead of the turbo BMW one his teammate was using. The Italian Bruno Giacomelli was 3rd, rounding out a pretty surprising top 3, although the 3 title contenders, Prost, Pironi and Rosberg, respectively, were in 4th, 5th and 6th. Arnoux led from pole until he spun off on lap 15 of 76, handing the lead to his teammate Prost. Prost then led up until rain began to spit on the circuit, and on lap 74, he crashed out on the exit of the seafront chicane. Riccardo Patrese was handed the lead until he himself spun out of a hairpin on lap 75, the second to last lap, which allowed Didier Pironi to then assume the lead. Pironi's engine then started misfiring as he came from the tunnel, and he crawled to a halt. The next person who was behind Pironi was Andrea De Cesaris. However, he ran out of fuel on their approach to Mirabel. Derek Daly would have then taken the lead had he not crashed out and lost his rear wing and damaged the gearbox, which then seized up before he could start the final lap. All of this chaos, with 5 different de facto leaders in 3 laps, allowed Riccardo Patrese, who had spun on the downhill section of the circuit at the hairpin, to free roll down the hill to bump start himself. After the 5 million different leaders, Patrese came across the line to make it 5 winners from 6 races and 5 consecutive races with a different winner. Pironi was classified 2nd despite not crossing the line, and 3rd was awarded to Andrea De Cesaris, who was in a similar situation. The Lotus pair of Nigel Mansell and Elio De Angelis came home 4th and 5th respectively, 1 lap down from the leaders, and Derek Daly was classified 6th. This race didn't have many championship ramifications, as neither Renault or McLaren finished in the points, and only 1 Ferrari and 1 Williams did finish in the points. This meant Prost was still leading the Drivers' Championship on 18 points, despite only finishing a third of the races so far. John Watson was still a point behind on 17, however now Pironi was just a point behind Watson and 2 off the lead on 16. Keke Rosberg was still on 14, and Patrase's win took him to 13 points and 5th in the drivers' standings. The Constructors' table had McLaren still on top on 29, Renault and Ferrari were now joint on 22, with Renault ahead on countback. Williams were in 4th on 21, and Lotus were in 5th on 14. The teams then prepared themselves for the 2nd race of the United States that season and the first ever Formula 1 race in Detroit. As part of F1's efforts to expand into the American market, they headed to Detroit. However, the race weekend saw some organisational issues. The Thursday practice session had to be cancelled and the Friday qualifying session had to be postponed until Saturday. Unfortunately, there was only time for a 1-hour practice session on the Friday, and then the typical 2 one-hour sessions of qualifying would take place 4 hours apart on the Saturday. Due to worries that rain was coming, drivers scrambled to set laps in the first session in case the weather was going to change. Their predictions were correct, and the second session was plagued with bad weather, and the times from the first session decided the grid. Alain Prost took another Renault pole position, averaging 83 miles an hour over his lap, which at that time was slower than Monaco. Andrea de Cesaris lined up second, with Keke Rosberg in third, Pironi in fourth, and surprisingly, the ATS of Manfred Winkelhock in fifth. De Cesaris' teammate, Bruno Giacomelli, was sixth, and the big contenders of Niki Lauda, René Arnoux, and John Watson could only muster 10th, 15th, and 17th, respectively. And the winner from last time out, Riccardo Patrese, only got 14th on the grid. Race day was sunny, and on starting the race, the top three of Prost, De Cesaris, and Rosberg retained their positions by the end of lap 1. After them followed Pironi's Ferrari, Mansell's Lotus, and the other Alfa of Bruno Giacomelli. Manfred Winkelhock's amazing qualifying was rewarded with the mechanical DNF on lap 1, and De Cesaris then retired on lap 3 with the broken driveshaft, which promoted Rosberg up to second. Following a collision between Roberto Guerrero and Elio De Angelis, the Colombian slid into the tyre barrier. The next few cars avoided the wreck, but Riccardo Patrese locked up and hit the wall as well, causing his brake duct to catch fire. With 2 stricken cars and a fire hazard, the clerk of the course called for a red flag. The drivers returned to the pits and various repairs were undertaken and strategies were changed. In a concept not seen in nearly 30 years now in Formula 1, last used in the 1994 Japanese Grand Prix, they used aggregate times to determine the result. How this worked was, they would take the timings from the moment the red flag was called, and the race would restart with those initial timings from the restart applied to them. In simple terms, if first place was, let's say, 20 seconds ahead of second, when the race restarted, if the second place driver wanted to win, they would have to not only overtake the first place driver, but he would also have to pull out a gap of more than 20 seconds to usurp the gap from the first part of the race. On the restart, Prost led again from Rosberg, Pironi, Giacomelli, and home hero Eddie Cheever and René Arnoux. Following an electrical issue, however, Prost lost his lead to Rosberg on lap 21, and Prost then pitted. Behind Rosberg, who was now leading, there was an intense fight between Didier Pironi, Bruno Giacomelli, Eddie Cheever and Niki Lauda. In 6th now was the McLaren of John Watson, up 11 positions from his 17th place grid slot. Cheever and Lauda then both overtook Giacomelli, and then Watson did the same. The Italian then launched a misjudged counter-attack and hit Watson, ending up in the wall as Watson continued. Pironi had been holding up the 2 cars of Lauda and Cheever, but John Watson drove right up to the back of them and passed them all on one lap to take second place behind Rosberg. Watson closed the gap to Rosberg by 6 seconds in 2 laps, then overtook the Finn as he lost 3rd gear. However, as the race was calculated during aggregate time, Rosberg would need to fall back 18 seconds to lose the net lead. Knowing this, Keke tried to stay as close to the tail of Watson as possible. Watson's teammate Lauda had now made his way up into 3rd position behind Rosberg, however. Following a reckless attempt to overtake the Williams, he locked up and hit the wall, which left the home hero Cheever in 3rd. Watson backed off as Rosberg's problems worsened, and the Finn eventually finished 4th. The slow nature of the circuit meant only a race average speed of 78 miles an hour, which meant that the race finished on reaching the 2-hour limit on lap 62 out of a planned 76, and Watson won, followed by Eddie Cheever and Didier Pironi. Rosberg was 4th, his teammate Derek Daly was 5th, and Jacques Laffite finished 6th. As Alain Prost had now gone 5 races without finishing, he dropped to 3rd in the drivers' standings behind John Watson and Didier Pironi, who were on 26 and 20 points each. Rosberg was 4th on 17 points, and Patrese was 5th on 13. McLaren still led the constructors on 38 points, followed by Ferrari and Williams in 2nd and 3rd, both on 26. Renault's persistent reliability issues left them 4th on 22, having not scored any points since round 2, and Lotus were 5th on 14 points. Canada's motorsport community was still in mourning, following the death of their idol of racing pioneer Gilles Villeneuve. So, racing at the circuit named in his honour was bound to bring some emotional weight. However, the fans supporting Ferrari may have had something to smile about, as Didier Pironi took pole position, the first non-Renault pole position since Long Beach, followed by the Renault pair of Arnoux and Prost. Nelson Piquet's Brabham was 4th, followed by Bruno Giacomelli and John Watson in the Alfa and McLaren respectively. At the start of the race, the light sequence behaved unusually, and Didier Pironi on pole stalled his engine, then lifted his hand to signal the problem. However, the start could not be aborted as it was already happening. Most cars avoided the stricken Ferrari as the lights went green. A few towards the back had minor scrapes, but the Acela of Riccardo Paletti was unable to avoid hitting Pironi's Ferrari, doing so at 110 miles an hour. Paletti was knocked unconscious and was trapped in the car by the steering wheel. As Sid Watkins and Pironi were attempting to extract Paletti from the car, it caught fire. Once the fire was put out, Paletti had no pulse. It took 25 minutes to safely cut him from the car, as the sparks from the cutting equipment might have reignited the blaze. After arriving at hospital by helicopter, he died shortly after. He was 24. The race was later restarted and Pironi and Arnoux led early on, but Nelson Piquet led from lap 9 until the finish to take the first win of his title defence campaign. His Brabham teammate Riccardo Patrese came home second, with John Watson finishing third. Elio De Angelis finished fourth, with Arrow's Mark Schurer taking the team's first points that season in fifth. Despite running out of fuel with 2 laps remaining, Andrea De Cesaris finished sixth to take his second points finish of the season, and after the forlorn weekend, John Watson still led the Drivers' Championship on 30 points, followed by Pironi on 20. Riccardo Patrese moved to third with 19, with Prost's 6th successive race without points dropping him to fourth. Keke Rosberg was now 5th on 17 points, and McLaren still led the Constructors' Championship on 42 points, with Ferrari and Williams not scoring any and remaining on 26, along with Renault. Brabham's 15-point haul took them to 19 points and 5th place in the Constructors' Championship. We are only halfway through the season, and we've already seen many controversies and political disputes. We've seen the death of 2 drivers, including a major title contender and beloved figure, and a battle for supremacy, where no one can really get an upper hand in the races. Renault had dominated qualifying, but their reliability meant they rarely got far enough into a race to make an impact. Williams had one driver who was picking up the pieces of others' misfortunes to pick up points where he could, and the other driver needed everyone else to fall off the track to get anywhere near the points. Ferrari had Pironi, but the loss of Villeneuve and the fact they had no replacement for him yet meant they were struggling. McLaren probably looked best overall, leading both the drivers and the constructors' standings, although their points were mostly coming from one driver, and it wasn't the driver who'd already won 2 drivers' titles. Brabham were quick-ish, but suffered from the same issues as Renault. This had culminated in there being 6 winners from the first 8 races from 4 different teams and 4 different engine suppliers. The season didn't actually have a summer break, so I decided to cut off the season into 2 equal halves to explain it. The next race would be at Zandvoort in the Netherlands for the Dutch Grand Prix. Going into the Dutch weekend, Ferrari had found a suitable replacement for the recently deceased Gilles Villeneuve in Frenchman Patrick Tambay. René Arnoux took another pole position for Renault, followed by his teammate Prost. Nelson Piquet put his Brabham third, with Didier Pironi's Ferrari in fourth. The top 6 was rounded up by Niki Lauda and Patrick Tambay, who had qualified a mere 3 tenths behind teammate Pironi at the first time of asking. The Williams of Keke Rosberg was 7th, and World Championship leader John Watson was down in 11th. On race day, René Arnoux lost the lead to teammate Prost at the start, and then his throttle jammed open on lap 21 going into turn 1, causing a massive crash scene. In the meantime, Didier Pironi had overtaken Prost for the lead and would hold the lead until the end of the race. Prost's engine gave way on lap 33, meaning it was now 7 races in a row where he failed to reach the checkered flag. Pironi's win was his 2nd of the season. He was one of 3 drivers who had 2 wins so far, along with Alain Prost and John Watson. Watson didn't have another incredible comeback race like he did in Detroit, as from his lowly grid spot, he finished 9th and outside the points. Nelson Piquet took 2nd place for Brabham, and 3rd was taken by Keke Rosberg. Niki Lauda took 4th, and Rosberg's teammate Derek Daly was 5th. Mauro Baldi took the Arrows team's 2nd points finish of the season in 2 races with 6th. Pironi's win had taken him within a mere point of John Watson, the 2 leading on 29 and 30 points respectively. Keke Rosberg was 3rd in 21, with Riccardo Patrese in 4th on 19. Alain Prost still clung onto the top 5 in the Drivers' Championship despite a finishing rate so far of just 22.2%. McLaren was still leading the Constructors on 45 points, followed by Ferrari on 35 and Williams on 32. Renault was still 4th on 22 and Brabham Ford were now 5th on 19. One thing to note was that because Brabham used both BMW and Ford engines during the season, the cars that ran with different makes of engines would be classed as separate in the Constructors' standings. This meant that Nelson Piquet hadn't scored any of Brabham Ford's points, as it was Patrese's 3 podiums that contributed to the team's 5th place tally. After a somewhat dull weekend. Considering the rest of the season, the teams would travel to Great Britain and the Brands Hatch circuit for the British Grand Prix. Qualifying in Britain saw Keke Rosberg take his first pole position of the season, followed by the Brabham pairing of Patrese and Piquet. Didier Pironi was 4th, Lauda came 5th, and the Renaults of René Arnoux and Alain Prost had their worst qualifying session of the season in 6th and 8th respectively. Championship leader John Watson qualified 12th in his McLaren, and early on, Nelson Piquet took the lead, but Lauda assumed the lead on lap 10 as Piquet retired. Derek Warwick's Tolman had started on a light fuel load with the intention of making progress up the field in a lighter car and then stopping for fuel later in the race. This idea worked, and he made his way up to 2nd place in an otherwise uncompetitive car. He stayed there until his half shaft broke on lap 40, forcing him to retire. John Watson spun off early on, and his teammate Niki Lauda took his 2nd win of the season. Didier Pironi's Ferrari was 2nd, followed by his teammate Patrick Tambay. Elio De Angelis has finished 4th for Lotus, and the Williams of Derek Daly finished 5th. Alain Prost broke his non-point scoring duck with a 6th place, and this result shook up the drivers' standings as only 2 of the top 5 going into the weekend finished the race. Didier Pironi now led the championship on 35 points, with Watson still on 30. Lauda's win took him up to 3rd on 24 points, and Keke Rosberg was 4th on 21 points. Prost's points finish helped him retain 5th on 19. McLaren was starting to be reeled in by Ferrari in the constructors now, as the Italian outfit was now on 45 points, just 9 behind the Woking team, who were now on 54 points. Williams retained 3rd on 34, Renault was still 4th on 23, and Lotus regained 5th on 20 points. The next race would take place in France at the Circuit Paul Ricard on home soil for the ever unlucky French team. Qualifying in France saw René Arnoux take pole position from his teammate Prost, as most people have been accustomed to by now. Didier Pironi made it an all-French top 3, followed by Riccardo Patrese's Brabham, Patrick Tambay's Ferrari and Nelson Piquet's Brabham. The naturally aspirated engine teams were clearly struggling, as the quickest naturally aspirated car was that of Niki Lauda in 9th place, 3.3 seconds off the pole time. Championship protagonists John Watson and Keke Rosberg were 12th and 10th respectively, and then race day came around. After some early position changes, the Renault pair of Arnoux and Prost pulled out a large gap on the field behind. However, everyone was expecting them to have some sort of issue which had befallen them in most of the races up to this point. But that didn't happen. They came across the line 1-2 with Arnoux in front, and all seemed well. But that was not entirely the case. Before the race, Arnoux had agreed not to fight Prost if they were in a position at the end where Renault could help his teammates' title ambitions. However, Arnoux didn't hold up his end of the deal, and fans were getting flashbacks to scenes earlier in the season between Pironi and Villeneuve, who had a similar agreement. Arnoux won with Prost 2nd, and the all-French Ferrari driver lineup made it a French 1-2-3-4 on home soil, with Pironi in 3rd and Tambay in 4th. After both Alfa Romeos and Brabhams fell away, Keke Rosberg and Michele Alboreto took 5th and 6th for Williams and Tyrrell respectively. An electrical issue forced John Watson to retire, and Niki Lauda, the winner last time out in Brands Hatch, finished 8th and lapped. Pironi now led the championship with the race wins advantage of 9 points over John Watson. Prost's 2nd place took him to 3rd on 25 points, just 1 clear of Lauda on 24. Keke Rosberg slipped to 5th position on 23 points. McLaren's inability to score anything meant Ferrari had now closed the gap to 2 points in the constructors, the two on 54 and 52 respectively. Renault's 15-point smash and grab launched them ahead of Williams, the French outfit now on 38 and Williams on 36. Lotus was still 5th on 20 points. This one race had accounted for 1/3 of Renault's total points in the season so far, and Arnoux was a 7th different winner of 1982. The championship was really starting to hot up as we moved into the final 5 races of the season. The next one at Hockenheim was going to be crucial if the drivers wanted to stop Pironi from running away with a title. The Hockenheim circuit had been modified for 1982 to increase safety. The first chicane in the forest section had been tightened, and a new chicane was added at the Ost curve to reduce speeds. These modifications could not prevent an accident which changed the course of the championship. Qualifying was held in extremely wet conditions, with visibility being very poor in the forested sections of the circuit. Didier Pironi approached the back of Alain Prost's Renault, who was moving at a much slower speed than the Ferrari. Pironi ramped over Prost's car into the air before cartwheeling on his return to the ground. Pironi got so much air that he later said that he could see the tops of the trees. This accident was very similar to the one that claimed the life of Gilles Villeneuve. However, Pironi survived, although he had severe leg injuries. This accident now meant the championship leader was sidelined until further notice, and the other drivers now had a chance to reel in the Frenchman's points advantage. Pironi had already set a time which was quick enough for pole position. However, his absence meant that his grid spot would be vacated on race day. The Renault duo of Prost and Arnoux qualified de facto first and second, with Nelson Piquet in third. Fourth was Patrick Tambay, fifth Riccardo Patrese, and sixth was the highest placed naturally aspirated car, the Tyrrell of Michele Alboreto. The long straights of Hockenheim accentuated the gap between the Turbo and NA cars. The difference between Patrese's Turbo Brabham and Alboreto's NA Tyrrell, just one position apart on the grid, was a staggering 2.8 seconds. Championship protagonists Keke Rosberg and John Watson were 9th and 10th on the grid, hoping for bad reliability to befall the turbo cars on race day. René Arnoux led on lap 1, however, he was overtaken by Nelson Piquet, who led up until he approached backmarker Eliseo Salazar. The two collided, and in a fit of rage, Piquet attacked Salazar as he punched and kicked the Chilean. Patrick Tambay assumed the race lead from Piquet in a lone Ferrari and duly won, which was a mere consolation on a weekend as grey as this one for Ferrari. Arnoux finished second, with Keke Rosberg in third, followed by the Tyrrell of Michele Alboreto, the Alfa Romeo of Bruno Giacomelli, and Marc Sure's Arrows, who claimed 6th place and 1 point. The top 5 in the Drivers' Championship stayed in the same order, as only one of them scored points. Pironi still led on 39, Watson was still second on 30, Rosberg was now third on 27, having still not yet won a race. Prost was 4th on 25 points, and Lauda, who withdrew from the race, was 5th on 24 points. Patrick Tambay became the 8th different winner that season, and the championship had now been turned on its head and flipped upside down, just like Pironi's car did multiple times. Bad timing? Sorry, don't mean to offend. Ferrari now led the constructors on 61 points, courtesy of Tambay's win ahead of a stagnant McLaren on 54. Renault were 3rd on 44 and Williams were now 4th on 40. Lotus were 5th on 20 points. The next race in Austria saw a front row lockout for the Brabham team, with Piquet following Patrese. 3rd was Alain Prost, 4th Patrick Tambay, 5th went to René Arnoux, and Rosberg was 6th. By this point, it had become clear that Didier Pironi would not return to driving duties before the season's end, so the drivers had a situation similar to that of 1970, where they had to try and usurp a driver who was leading the championship but would not partake in any of the remaining rounds. John Watson had been on a 4-race long points drought, and his fortunes weren't looking good to break that duck as he qualified 18th. At the start of the race, Piquet led away and Prost moved past Patrese into second. A lap 1 crash eliminated both Alfa Romeos and the second Williams of Derek Daly. Patrese then repassed Prost, and the Ferrari of Patrick Tambay got a puncture, and the Tyrrell of Michele Alboreto retired. Patrese then overtook his teammate Piquet for the lead, and they both pulled away from the rest of the field. When Piquet came into the pits for his stop, he became the first F1 driver to make a pit stop for both fuel and for tyres. This goes alongside his other records, along with 3 drivers' titles, 23 race wins, the most racist world champion award, and the least liked Brazilian motor racing award. Piquet rejoined the race, still a knobhead, but is now in 4th place, behind his yet-to-pit teammate Patrese, Alain Prost and Elio De Angelis. When Patrese pit, he retained the lead, but shortly after his stop, he retired with mechanical problems. Piquet then retired with an electrical failure himself. He then proceeded to blame the retirement on the car's black box, for obvious reasons. The top 3 was now Prost, De Angelis and Rosberg. It stayed that way until Prost had a mechanical failure of his own, leaving De Angelis and Rosberg to fight for what would be either of their first Formula 1 wins. Rosberg reeled De Angelis in, gaining 1.5 seconds on the final lap, but it wasn't enough to cross the line in front, as De Angelis won by 0.05 seconds from Keke, becoming the 9th different winner of the season. Jacques Laffite took 3rd for Ligier, and Patrick Tambay recovered to 4th place, with Niki Lauda in 5th and Mauro Baldi's Arrows taking 6th. John Watson retired early on with a mechanical failure, which meant Rosberg moved past him and into 2nd place in the drivers' standings on 33 points, just 6 behind Pironi's tally. Watson was now on 30 points, 4 ahead of 4th place Lauda and 5 ahead of 5th place Prost. Ferrari maintained their constructors' lead on 64 and McLaren stayed 2nd on 56. Williams moved past Renault on 46 with the French outfit staying on 44. De Angelis' win boosted Lotus up to 29 points in 5th place. The French Dijon-Prenois circuit hosted the Swiss Grand Prix, as F1 again showed its continuous, amazing knowledge of geography, which had been proven so many times over the years, as they've hosted the San Marino Grand Prix, which was in Italy, hosting the Luxembourg, Grand Prix in Germany and hosting the European GP in the Asian country of Azerbaijan. After doing their morning ritual of defecating on the World Atlas, the Swiss Grand Prix weekend was started by the FIA, which is strange considering Switzerland has banned all motorsport after the Le Mans disaster in 1955, a ban that still stands to this day for non-electric powered motorsport. Something else strange was that Patrick Tambay was unable to compete in the weekend as he had sustained an injury. As Ferrari still hadn't found a replacement for Didier Pironi, the Constructors' Championship leaders didn't compete in the weekend at all, marking the third and last time in F1 history that Ferrari didn't start a Grand Prix in which they'd entered. The second being the withdrawal of Pironi following his teammate's fatal crash in the Belgian race earlier on in the year. Qualifying saw a customary Renault 1-2 with Prost and Arnoux, followed by Riccardo Patrese, Niki Lauda, Andrea de Cesaris and Nelson Piquet. Keke Rosberg was 8th, behind his teammate Derek Daly, and John Watson was 11th. Arnoux led lap 1, but lost the lead to his teammate Prost on lap 2. Prost would then lead until lap 78 of 80, when Keke Rosberg passed him and duly won the race, his first race win of the season and the first of his career. Prost came home second, with McLaren's Niki Lauda in third. Piquet and Patrese were 4th and 5th, and new race winner De Angelis finished 6th, rounding out the points. Rosberg was the 10th different winner of 1982, and he had now usurped Pironi's points tally, now on 42 to the Frenchman's 39. Alain Prost was now third on 31 points, overtaking John Watson, who still hadn't added to his tally, but now Watson was equal on points with teammate Lauda. The lack of Ferrari meant McLaren closed to 4 points behind the Italians, the Ferrari tally of course remaining at 64. Williams were now on 55 in third, and Renault on 50 were fourth. Lotus were now 5th on 30 points. Going into the last 2 rounds in Italy and the USA, the Drivers' Championship was still undecided and the Constructors' Championship was very close, so it will be interesting to see who will come out on top. Ferrari entered 2 cars into the Italian Grand Prix, as Tambay had recovered from his injury and they had recruited a replacement for Pironi, who would be in until season's end for the last 2 races of the season. They had recruited an ex-world champion, in fact the 1978 world champion Mario Andretti, who was now 42 and hadn't raced in F1 since 1981. So, you'd think considering his age and lack of recent seat time, he would need time to get adjusted. Andretti proceeded to get pole position in front of the Tifosi. Joining him on the front row was Nelson Piquet's Brabham, with Patrick Tambay in third. The top 6 was rounded up by Riccardo Patrese and the Renault duo of Prost and Arnoux. Rosberg was 7th and John Watson, who was still in the title fight, was 12th. Despite Andretti getting pole, it was René Arnoux who led the opening laps for Renault, and he would eventually lead every single lap of the race and get fastest lap. Tambay finished second, with Andretti claiming third place on his F1 return. John Watson finally scored some more points with 4th place, and Michele Alboreto and Eddie Cheever rounded out the points, coming home 5th and 6th for Tyrrell and Ligier respectively. Keke Rosberg didn't have the pace for points, but following Watson's 4th place going into the last race, Rosberg led on 42 points. Didier Pironi was second, but unable to score any more points, obviously. John Watson was third on 33 points, and following his mid-season drought, he was the only driver who could realistically usurp Rosberg in the final race of the season. Alain Prost was 4th on 31 points, with Lauda 5th on 30 going into the final race. Ferrari still led the constructors on 74 points, 11 clear of McLaren on 63. Renault were 3rd on 59, followed by Williams on 55 and Lotus in 5th on 30 points. 3 teams could win the Constructors' Championship at the last race, but not Williams, whose first driver now led the championship. In a weird turn of fate, the last race of the season was going to be held on the Caesars Palace circuit built on the car park of a casino. The circuit hosted its first race the year prior in 1981, and many drivers were loving its long, sweeping bends, challenging undulation and beautiful scenery. That is, if you consider long sweeping bends as the racetrack embodiment of Control-C and Control-V, challenging undulation as none whatsoever, and beautiful scenery as a bland city in the desert. And by many drivers, I mean no drivers. The drivers actually disliked the circuit, citing its corners which placed excessive fatigue on their necks due to heavy left-handed cornering, a lack of natural or otherwise braking markers, and a generally uninspiring layout that provided no entertainment nor action. And this would be the season finale. There were 2 drivers who could win the title, Keke Rosberg and John Watson, although Watson would need to win and have Rosberg finish lower than 6th to win the title. Qualifying saw the Renault 1-2 everybody was used to, with Prost leading Arnoux. Michele Alboreto's Tyrrell was 3rd, and Eddie Cheever was 4th for Ligier. Riccardo Patrese was 5th, with Keke Rosberg in 6th place. John Watson was 9th on the grid. At the race start, Prost led Arnoux, followed by Alboreto and Cheever, after a battle between the two drivers saw Alboreto come out on top. Arnoux then passed Prost on lap 2, but lost the position again on lap 15. Arnoux then retired on lap 21 with another mechanical issue, rounding out his season. After a bad start saw John Watson drop to 12th, he slowly made his way up the field, to 3rd, closing in on Prost and Alboreto in front. Watson was getting close to what he needed, but by this point, Rosberg was in 5th place, which was more than he needed to win the title. But McLaren of Niki Lauda then retired, and Alboreto closed to Prost and passed him, with the Frenchman struggling on worn tyres, as Watson also passed Prost, but was unable to catch Alboreto. Alboreto won the first race of his career and became the 11th winner from the 16 races in 1982, with Watson coming home second. Home hero Eddie Cheever overtook Prost for 3rd, and Prost himself finished P4. Keke Rosberg had a steady drive to 5th place in order to guarantee his world title win, and Rosberg's teammate Derek Daly was 6th. The final driver standings saw Keke Rosberg win the title with 44 points, averaging only 2.75 points per race. Didier Pironi finished 2nd in the end on 39 points, equal to John Watson, but was ahead on countback, not for having more wins, not for having more second places, but because he had 2 third-place finishes to Watson's 1. Prost finished 4th on 34 points, with Niki Lauda coming 5th on 30 points. Ferrari won the Constructors' Championship on 74 points, despite losing 2 of their drivers mid-season. McLaren's reliability meant they finished 2nd on 69 points, nice, while Renault's lack of reliability meant they only got 62 points and 3rd place. Despite winning the driver's title with Rosberg, the loss of Carlos Reutemann early in the season and Derek Daly's inability to provide good results in his place meant Williams only got 4th place in the Constructors on 58 points. Lotus were 5th on 30 points. In total then, during the 1982 season, 11 different drivers won races. Those drivers were Keke Rosberg driving for Williams, Didier Pironi and Patrick Tambay driving for Ferrari, John Watson and Niki Lauda for McLaren, René Arnoux and Alain Prost both for Renault, Michele Alboreto for Tyrrell, Elio De Angelis for Lotus, and the Brabham pairing of Riccardo Patrese and Nelson Piquet. There were also 7 drivers who didn't win but did appear on the podium, namely Eddie Cheever, who got a 2nd and 2 thirds for Ligier, Nigel Mansell, who got 1 third place for Lotus, Carlos Reutemann, who got a 2nd place for Williams, Gilles Villeneuve, who got 1 2nd place for Ferrari before his death, Andrea de Cesares, who got 1 third place for Alfa Romeo, Jacques Lafitte, who got a 3rd for Ligier, and Mario Andretti, who got 1 third for Ferrari. This meant in total, during the 1982 season, there were 11 race-winning drivers, 18 podium-finishing drivers, and 26 point-scoring drivers. This number would be 31, however, if we use the modern point system. As for the constructors, 5 teams got a pole position, namely Renault, Ferrari, Williams, Brabham BMW, and Alfa Romeo. 8 constructors won races, namely those listed before, minus Alfa Romeo, alongside Brabham Ford, who counted as a different constructor to the BMW powered team. McLaren got 2nd place in the constructors, despite not getting a single pole position throughout the season, along with Lotus and Tyrrell. 10 teams achieved podiums, the only one not mentioned yet is Ligier, and 14 teams in total scored points. The ones I haven't mentioned in this segment yet are Arrows, ATS, Osella and Fittipaldi. To conclude, the 1982 season was crazy for lots of reasons. It seemed like the racing gods just randomly picked which driver would win each race out of a hat, and that's why I'll be doing a follow-up video in the near future, which will discuss exactly why this season is so random and strange compared to all the others. And with that, we finally reached the end of the video. I hope you enjoyed it, despite its long length, as I'm aware that on YouTube, size does in fact matter. And with that, leave your thoughts in the comments down below and tell me what topic you'd like to see a video on next. I'll see you all later. Have a good one. Bye.